welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Arvon. Do you have a story in you? Or want to test the waters of writing poetry or non-fiction? Maybe you already write, and write well, but would like to try a new form or genre, pick up some new tricks.
Enter Arvon. Arvon runs a yearly programme of in-person and online events, from 5-day residential writing weeks that take place at one of its 3 writing houses, to a flexible online programme featuring 5-week online evening courses, masterclasses, and pay-what-you-can events. Arvon's courses cover everything from fiction, non-fiction, and poetry to screenwriting and even songwriting.
They've been running creative writing courses up and down the UK since 1968. In that time, their prize-winning tutors, many of whom may be some of your favourite writers, have unlocked the creativity of over 100,000 people. Many have gone on to be published authors and career writers themselves.
But actually, it's not about that. Writing with Arvon is about finding a supportive community of fellow writers, making like-minded connections that last a lifetime. By signing up for a course, you don't just get an acclaimed author as your tutor, you also gain a writing group to bounce ideas off long after the course is finished.
So whether it's a cosy stay at one of their writing houses in Devon, West Yorkshire or sleepy Shropshire, or a course you can do from the comfort of your sofa, Arvon works around your creative life.
Visit arvon.org/courses, that's arvon.org/courses, to learn more and give yourself the gift of writing.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we spoke with the screenwriter and playwright Abi Morgan.
We spoke to Abi about breaking into the industry, working on biopics and book adaptations, and her latest TV series, Eric.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome, Abi, to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Could we start with Eric? You've described it as the story of a father, his missing son, and the monster that lives under the bed, but you've also said that the missing boy is a Trojan horse. Could you tell us a little bit more about that TV show?
Well, I mean, at the heart of Eric is, as you said, it's a quest for a father to find his son. But in many ways, I see it as a kind of fable, like a little like Hansel and Gretel. And that as we watch, we open the series and we see a really dysfunctional family and we realize that Edgar, this boy, is at the heart of it. And as we watch that marriage collapse, so occurs Edgar's disappearance. And so I'm kind of playing with that idea of the dysfunction of a family is also in parallel with the dysfunction of a city. And as this father goes on a quest to find his son, he sort of goes on a journey to find himself, but is confronted with all the different elements and obstacles and challenges that one might find in the city at that time. And so it was almost my aim to kind of try and mix the absurd with the real. And the reason why I call it a Trojan horse is that you believe it's about the disappearance of one boy, but you come to realize it's also about the disappearance of another boy and the way our children can get lost in those cracks when we stop protecting and looking after them, and the institutions that are meant to do that, stop looking out for them too.
So one thing that our listeners are always fascinated by in any literary discipline is how a piece of work kind of made it into the world. So with the example of Eric, could you tell us how the commissioning process worked?
Yeah, I mean, so the way TV works, I'm sure you've had a myriad of TV writers on this, but, TV is very specific in the way it works. So, we get paid per episode or per series, whereas, with film writing, you tend to get paid per draft. And so there's a sort of more emphasis, I think, on writers really owning TV work, partly because we can be held to ransom for that last 25% of the deal, whereas actually you get cut off much more in film writing. But the way the process therefore worked with Eric was, I had a relationship with our mentor at Netflix already. I work a lot with Sister, which is a brilliant production company, and particularly Jane Featherstone, who's my kind of core collaborator. And I'd been batting around a few ideas, and I'd gone out for lunch with Anne and she'd asked me did I have any new ideas in mind? And I sort of presented 2 or 3, possible shows to her, and they were in very early form. But fundamentally, they were sort of, I think I delivered the kind of basic premise of Eric in one line, which is it's about one of America's leading puppeteer who goes on a quest to find his missing son in the company of a 7-foot Blue Puppet. And that was really as simple as the initial kind of kick out into the world was. And then, and Anne immediately got very excited by that idea and was really interested. And so we went away, Jane and I basically did a very simple outline for that first episode and a Bible for the show. And then we kind of represented that with Anne and got the commission for the first episode. And then once that process of building that episode and obviously doing the incredible number of drafts that we did, we then we delivered it to Netflix. And from that point, we got the green light to then make the rest of the show.
And so is that quite common then that someone like Netflix would have lots of relationships with particular production companies and writers such as yourself?
I think so. I mean, I've worked with Netflix before with a show called River, but they actually bought that a lot later. So I've had a certain relationship and I've known Anne over the years. I've never directly worked with her. But I think, yes, I think you form relationships, but also your work is tracked. You're approached sometimes by those production companies. I work exclusively with Sister of my television work. And so I tend to work sort of very in-house with them, and I'll come up with ideas and we'll discuss, and with Jane, and the company will work out, should it be a streamer? Should it be a network? Where is the best place to place this show? So, partly it comes out of the fact that I know some of these people and it'll come through that territory. Sometimes I don't know them at all and we just, we like what they're doing, we like their work. There may be another model of work where we feel it's sort of in the right wheelhouse as the kind of show that we're trying to do. So then it will be a matter of making an approach and saying, do you have any time to talk? Or sometimes it can be that we're further down the line and we've actually got a script and we offer the script. And then you may have 2 or 3 companies interested in that script and then you're working out where it should be placed. So it really varies. I mean, I tend to get the first episode into a really good shape. I may have attracted interest from a network or a streamer, but I tend to go off and write that first episode on my own with Sister. And Sister are very good at commissioning work before it's actually found a home. So that also gives you a certain freedom. And so I may work on that episode and then get it to a place where I feel like it's ready. There's a Bible. And also, Bibles have really changed. When I was first going out, 20 odd years, you may have had a couple of A4 pages. I think we've become very influenced by the film model, but also by the US show running model, where you do need an extensive Bible, but also you do much more of a mood board now. You may offer imagery, you may graphically display your work, you may even have a kind of PowerPoint presentation. So there's much more emphasis on really feeling like the package of the show is ready. Fundamentally, I think nothing beats that first script. Reading that first script, I think you can often excite a commissioner that way. And I think with Anne, we had enough of a relationship to say, look, we'll come back to you when we feel we've got an episode in place. And that's how that worked. And then, of course, they came on board.
And again, for people who may not be familiar with the terminology, could you explain what a Bible is? And, as that point you were saying about how it's become much more expansive. I mean, I remember being shown the Bible for The Wire, which was like a kind of extraordinary document. But again, just for some of our listeners who may not know, these particular terminology, could you unpack that?
Yeah, I mean, well, fundamentally, first, don't be frightened by the idea of the Bible. I think there's a lot of mythology around the Bible. It is incredibly personal to the writer, but basically, what I tend to do, my version of a Bible might be a first episode outline, or possibly I may have got to the point where I have a script. And then the other five episodes, 6, 8 episodes, however many episodes, I may have had a very simple arc where I have a simple arc for each storyline, and it may be no more than a page or a couple of pages, sometimes half a page. And then within that, I may also have character breakdowns of sort of 5 or 6 of the key characters. And I may have a very simple kind of page breakdown of the world, and then maybe a half-page breakdown of what I feel is the tone and the style. And then I may have a kind of mood board of different images that may have been very important to me. I mean, the more I've gone on as a writer, I tend to really lean into visual imagery. So I often collect, a vast array of photos and articles, etc. So I may have also embedded those in the document. But at its simplest, you can also go in with 2 pages. You don't have to do the all bells and all, whistles. What you're really trying to do is get an initial interest from a commissioner. So that may be a conversation. I think you can design what you want, which will best work for the way you want to present your work, but also the best works for your process. And it's just so happened that over time, I find Bibles incredibly useful because it's a way to sort of share a collective sensibility for the show, and it's also part of the ongoing dialogue with the show. So as you share that with your collaborators, be that a producer, be that a script editor, and then subsequently a director, you're always moving a project forward in some way. You're developing not only the simple dialogue bones of the script, you're also thinking about the wider picture of the world and where you want to place this. And so it starts to help you kind of work out where the weight of that show may lie. Does it feel more like a dramedy? Does it feel more like a comedy? Does it feel actually front and center in the heart of drama? Is it right? Is it in the right form? Does 6 episodes feel right? Could we push it to 8? Do 8 feel too many? We're also at a time where we're getting different feedback, and it changes all the time from streamers and commissioners about what length they watch. I've worked, although preferring at that time, I've worked a lot in the BBC, and it's the traditional 58, 59 minutes. But actually, with Netflix, it was much more at that time 52 minutes, around 52 minutes. So you can play around with the length of scripts because it's not dependent on advertising. So even that, you could start to think, I don't think this show's right for a full hour. It feels like a half-hour show, So I think it's quite a good way to explore not just the kind of initial kind of kick-off point of your first episode, but where you feel the show might go and where you feel it might land.
I can imagine as well, once a director has come on board, having that mood board and all the kind of tonal aspects of it, very helpful for them.
Really helpful.
In terms of Eric, what was on your kind of mood board then? I mean, it's set in New York in the 1980s. What kind of feel did you want it to have?
I think I was I was leaning into the movies I loved from the 70s and early 80s. So that's everything from Taxi Driver through to Kramer versus Kramer, through to Tootsie. And knowing that there was a kind of palette that was more of a nod to the 70s than the 80s. It wasn't going to have that kind of day glow brightness of the 80s, the kind of coming of the new. I think we all felt that because it was a show about a creative who had been, at the top of his game for the last 10 years, we wanted to kind of look at the genesis of that creative. And so I think we felt that the world he came from was more of the kind of late 60s, early 70s. So when you start to cast that shadow over the 80s, not only through the character of Vincent, but then you start to look at the shadow that was over America at that time, certainly the shadow that was over the city. And so it was a country that had gone through the Vietnam War. So it had a huge legacy of veterans. Someone like Vincent, who is an artist, who is a puppeteer and, running this incredible workshop in the heart of New York, is also doing this with his collaborator and best friend, Lenny. And so we worked on that idea, okay, what would be the music they would live, they loved from the 70s. And that was very key with Lucy Forbes, who was our director on the show. She really brought that element of music into the show. I think she's got an exquisite taste when it comes to music. And so that was when we really started to explore, okay, what does music mean in this show? And I think it's both nostalgic, but also it's about a mood and evoking a sort of, every episode has a very strong track which evokes a mood and a moment in that episode as well as that time. So, but in terms of the imagery, I was leaning into a lot of photography from the 60s, 70s, 80s, early 80s, a lot of street photography, looking at everything from reportage photography through to something more stylized.
So a question that we always put to novelists when we have them on the show is how they go about constructing their narratives, to what extent they plan in advance and to what extent they drop in. And the sense we get is often with screenwriting, there is more of this process of planning. And we saw that you have neat squares of paper on the wall. So what's your process when it comes to, how much is worked out in advance and how much evolves as you're putting words on the page?
I have shapes. I tend to put on the wall structural shapes, and that from that I find character elements, or I start to feel where there's a hole in the show. And sometimes that can be a plot point. Sometimes that can be a failing in the world, but sometimes it can be that you've got too many characters. So that's definitely where I start out, but very quickly I go back onto the page. So it's something that I might do for 2-3 days. Sometimes with a producer. For example, I write another show called The Split, which is much more episodic. It has much more of a formula. That's something that I will break story with my producers and my script editor, and that may be much more, follow a much more of a format. When I'm doing a limited series like Eric, it has a free form to it. I perhaps approach it more like I'm, in a way, approaching a novel, actually, having started to write novels a little bit myself, but also in the way that I might approach a play. So it may have a big, or even a film. So I may be looking at a big sort of thematic arc, but I don't set out with a handful of themes. It can start with something incredibly simple. And when I say, when I first pitched Eric, it was that very simple idea of, I want to go on a quest with a creative who has to use his creativity to find himself, find his son, and understand his own psychosis. Then that was the starting point. And from that, when I then placed that in the prism of the 80s, then I started to throw up a lot of obvious character, obvious tropes, actually. And I think I'm playing with that show. I'm playing with quite a lot of tropes. I'm playing with the New York apartment. I'm playing with the police station. I'm playing with City Hall. And so they start to throw up character and ideas. And there felt like there was a lot I could lean into of that era and that time, but also of the kind of expectations of TV movies and films of that time that had those kind of worlds, and then slightly subvert them. So the gay black cop is dealing with something much darker at home, and the kind of all-American apartment, actually there's dysfunction going on there, and the City Hall is rife with its own problems. So I was able to kind of start to play around and find patterns. And that's often what I'm doing, is I'm finding patterns. But I will start out by very simply using quite large, they can be post notes or they can be, small record cards. And I will start to just plot out. So I start to see the shape, and then very quickly I'll bring it back onto the page, and I can sort of then start to control the material and start to shape it. And then I'll start to bring in images, and certainly with character, I normally have 2 or 3 key characters, and they will be my driver. And then I'll start to realize, okay, they're going to have to cross points with a detective. They're going to have to cross points with a lawyer. There's a caretaker somewhere in here, because we have to have someone who bridges the world of the apartment to the outside world. And so you then start to think, okay, that's an interesting character. You start to then perhaps find your secondary characters. But I don't think there is ever one way. I think it's very hard to teach writing. It's like teaching. You can give someone the basic steps, but everybody's going to dance in a different way. And if we all danced and followed exactly those steps, then it would be the same dance, So I'm a bit more freeform than that. So there's no one method for each. Each show is slightly different. And weirdly, having written now for 25 years, I don't know entirely what my method is. It tends to change for every job.
Do you think it's something, you mentioned the shape there and the kind of A, B and C storylines and bringing people into contact, conflict. Do you think it's something that kind of just comes to you quite naturally in terms of creating those obstacles and those plot points? Or is it something that you do sometimes have to reshape and kind of think, actually, this scene needs more, oomph to it?
I'm brutal with my work. I get it wrong all the time. On a fundamental level, it's all about what you leave out. And it's constantly throwing away work and getting rid of work. And for me, sometimes you do something very simple. It's a very simple through line. It's a love story between 2 people. They have a series of obstacles. They overcome them. They find each other again, and we have a resolution. Other times it's more of an ensemble. And so they demand different things. But fundamentally, I tend to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. There are certain writers who I know and respect and love, and they may deliver no more than 2-3 drafts before it's ready to shoot. I probably deliver on average 6 to 8 drafts, if not more, and there are iterations in between. And that's often, so I will often realize I've started the story in the same wrong place. But actually, fundamentally, I'm normally holding on to sort of 4 or 5 key images, and I kind of know where they're going to land. So I knew, for example, I had a very key last image for Eric, and I was on my way there from the day one. And it has remained the same. So I may have 2 or 3 other big thoughts along there, and I'm trying to weave my way through. So it's a bit like trying to make sense of your dream. You dream for a while, and you start to create this dream world and this dream state, and then you have to start to kind of join the dots and go, why am I writing? What does that mean? What am I trying to say? Is that a character I need? Is it relevant? Let's get rid of it. Let's add in this character. So, for example, Michael Adroit, who was a detective at the heart of the show, he was originally, it was a man and a woman in that role. But because I realized that it was a show that was about male toxicity, I decided to change that. And so I evolved that quite late on. And it became, and two characters became one. And then the other element that happens is you then bring on those other elements like director, who obviously evolves and changes and helps you find that world. But an actor can do a tremendous amount for that. So sometimes you can suddenly think, my God, this actor is amazing. And their part gets bigger and you want to write more for them because you realize that they can hold a role in the way that you didn't expect them to. So again, there's also evolution in that as well.
We want to come back to some of these process questions later on, but could we roll back now to your early life? We saw that your mum was an actor in rep and you had quite an itinerant childhood. You had ambitions to be an actor yourself, is that right?
Well, only as much as, and I've said this again and again, so forgive me for repeating myself, but I've never found a better sort of image, which is, if your dad's an electrician, you kind of know how to rewire a plug, I would hope. And I just assumed I would kind of go into the family business. But I knew very quickly that A, I wasn't very good, and B, I couldn't transform. I didn't know how to transform myself in the way that I see actors. I couldn't turn that light on. I couldn't sort of be anything other than myself and what I was. So it didn't feel like the right place for me. But I think what is true is I grew up genuinely in a family of storytellers, and my father was a theatre director. And so myself and my sister and my brother, we all spent our early years either watching our mother in plays or our father making plays. And, we were in our father's plays when we were younger. So we spent a long time backstage, on stage. And so the world of creativity and the way and the function and the necessity of it in day-to-day life was in the same way as sport might be for a family or, literature might be for a family. Creating work was just at the heart of our living, and it was a job. So yeah, I came from that world, but I knew very quickly that I didn't want to act. And then I guess the other thing about acting is you are waiting for someone to give you a script or to give you a role. And the thing about writing, the revelation for me was I could do it on my own. I didn't have to wait for anybody. Yes, you've got to get your work on, but in a way I could do my audition in the privacy of my own home and write my piece, and then I could give it to someone and they could respond to that. And that felt much more accessible to me than learning a piece of Shakespeare and trying to go for a job,
I read that it was at university after you were forced to write a monologue, which you described as a bad Alan Bennett ripoff, that you kind of got the writing bug. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I wonder if this is true for all writers. I think there's a moment where one of two things happened for me. There was a moment I never enjoyed school. I enjoyed my very early years at primary school, but I wasn't academic and I fundamentally found it very hard to literally stay in a classroom. So I kind of fell into going to university eventually because it was an English and drama degree. Yeah, I did. But there was a moment when I wrote this monologue and I performed it. And as I said, it was a bad Alan Bennett ripoff. But I think in the 2.5 years I've been at university, it was the first time any tutor really spoke to me. And one of my tutors came up and said that was good. And then the second thing is I heard silence in the audience. And I think I've been chasing that silence ever since. And there is something very particularly, that's why I really advocate for writers to experience theatre work, because there's something very special about being in a space where in live real time when people are watching your work on stage and listening to your words. And it's a great barometer to really see when you can hold an audience and to feel when you're losing them. And I think for me, that was when I thought, okay, I've found something that I genuinely find absorbing and I enjoy doing, and it's expressing something quite important and deep in me, and yet it's nothing to do with my life. So therefore it's not therapy, it's not, And then the second thing was I realised that I might be able to hold an audience, and that feeling of knowing I wanted to do something creative, but I knew that I couldn't act, I suddenly sort of started to feel like I might be able to find a home for myself. And that was a very powerful moment. And I wonder if every writer has a moment like that. And that could be the moment someone read a chapter of their work, or if someone wrote a letter and said you really should write, or, you have your first stage play, whatever it is. I hope that every writer has that moment, because it becomes a very self-fulfilling, self-defining, self-motivating nugget, sort of navigational point in myself. And I don't think I've ever forgotten that feeling of actually going, okay, I think I know this is what I want to do. And I think your 20s is one of the hardest periods. It certainly was in my life, because you're trying to find yourself on every level. You're trying to find your identity. You're trying to financially find your place in the world. And you're also watching people slip out of the traditional slipstream of, school, university, and suddenly then everyone's off like hares and you don't necessarily follow the same timelines. And so for me, the one thing I had to hold on to was my writing. And I think it steered me through the sort of first 5-6 years of my 20s and kind of became the way I could, whatever other rubbish job I was doing, I could come back and write and hold on to this kind of dream of making it my career.
So could you tell us about your kind of early professional steps? So via Skinned in 1998 and then working in peak practice, how did you make your way?
Well, I came out from university and I worked for a year as an actress touring abroad, a sort of theatre and education company. And that was really fun. But I realised that the thing I was missing was that thing. It took someone else actually to say, I think you need to write, in one of the other actresses I was working with, because I didn't find acting fulfilling. And again, I wasn't terribly good. So I came back and I then did every waitressing job in town. And I'm very grateful for that because I still have some of my greatest girlfriends are from that period. And we've all become artists and editors and designers. So it was a great, it was a great sort of feeding ground for kind of creatives who didn't go straight into their profession. So I was sort of doing those money jobs. And at that time, a girlfriend who knew someone who ran the Arvin Foundation rang me and said, you know what, someone's just dropped out for a week. I'm going to go down. Would you like to come with me? So I had a free week at the Arvin Foundation, which is an organisation that, encourages writers and you can come and do residential weeks. And during that week, I wrote the first sort of couple of scenes of Skinned. And I'd done some research. I knew I wanted to do something that was quite research-based, so I'd spent a bit of time. Skinned is about a community who all work in an abattoir and the death of a young Asian boy at the heart of it. And I'd gone into an abattoir and I'd experienced that world and I thought there's something really interesting in this world. And so I started to write this play. And someone said, start to look for competitions, So I started to keep an eye out for competitions. And from that, I motivated myself to kind of keep writing this first stage play. And I sent it in for a competition. And I think it didn't win, but I think it got shortlisted for the Croydon Warehouse Theatre Workshop Prize. And then it was picked up by Southampton Nuffield Theatre. And so that was my first professional gig. And then from that, your work starts. I think theatre's an amazing space because at that time it got reviews, and at that time people came to see. We had a lot of pub theatres, and we had a lot of rep was still very powerful and strong at that time. And also I had a play to show people, and from that I bumped into someone I was at university with, and I didn't know them terribly well. And I said, "Look, I'm trying to write, do some stage work." And she said, "Well, his friend was working at the Donmar Warehouse at the time as a literary associate for Sam Mendes." And she said, "Look, we're not going to do it at the Donmar, but there is this Carlton screenwriting course, and it's trying to encourage people who've done theatre to come and do some television." And that is how I got into it. I got on this course, which was basically 2 weekends. And the first weekend you got together, you pitched an idea, and then in the 3 months in between, you wrote a single screenplay, and it could be 60, 90 minutes, and you worked with a script editor. And then the second weekend, your screenplay was read, and you got to meet some producers. And from that, I met the producer on Peak Practice, and they read my script and said, "Why don't you come and do a trial on Peak Practice?" And so I joined Peak Practice, which was a medical drama set in Derbyshire, weekly drama. And then from that, I got to write my first 1 or 2 episodes of that show. And I realised a couple of things very quickly is I really enjoyed it and I learned a huge amount. And it was a great show. But I also thought to myself, I can never write anyone else's work. And it was just obvious to me I couldn't quite pick up the voice of the form of other people. I had to kind of write it in my way. And so, out of that, I was approached by a small production company who had read my stage play. And, a lot of those production companies, they had their literary managers, they have their heads of development who go to see theatre. And they had read Skinned. And also through Skinned, I started to form a theatre relationship with Payne's Plough, which was a new writing company. And so they commissioned a theatre play. And from that relationship, they then read the start of that theatre play, and I was invited by Drama, which was then Tiger Aspect. The people who ran Tiger Aspect now run Drama Republic, and they asked me, to come in and chat, and did I have any ideas? And I went in with absolutely no idea, but I remember sitting down with the producer at the time, and development heads at the time, which was Rana Ben and Greg Bremlin and Becky D'Souza. And they're all very successful in the industry now. They've just made One Day, so they're a fantastic production company, and they're in Right Now. And they said, we're looking for ideas of community and set in community. And I went, I've got an idea set in the community in my hometown, which at the time was Stoke-on-Trent. And they said, we really want something about friends. And I went, it's about an old group of friends in Stoke-on-Trent. And I built it in the room. And out of that very initial conversation, they commissioned possibly an outline or a first script. And so then I started to move very quickly into writing my own work. So it was kind of, I often say to writers, it's when you stop running to it, it happens. And actually, at the point where I think it was around about my stage play period, maybe just after, I was making no money. It was very, very hard to make money from theatre at that time. And I was just filling in the forms for teacher training. And just out of that is when I was approached by, I think, Paid's Plough, and then very quickly by Drama Republic, and they invited me to come in and work with them. And that was it. But for a minute, a very strong moment, I was like, I'm going to give it up. I'm going to do, I think I was probably by this time 25, 26. And I thought, I've got to make some proper money. I can't carry on like this. And so it was, and I think it was that point where I gave up that it came to me. That's my theory. I stopped trying so hard. I just let go of something. And around about that time, I started to make, I finally was able to start to give up the waitressing jobs and start to earn, not huge amounts of money, but certainly enough that I didn't need to waitress anymore.
That's fascinating. And we often like to ask people about how they kind of made it work financially early on. So thank you for sharing that. Could we jump ahead now to 2004 and Sex Traffic, the two-part drama that won a BAFTA about teenage girl trafficked from the Balkans to the UK? Is it right to say that was really kind of your breakout moment? And is that when things kind of really changed for you?
I think so. I mean, I think it was my third show, actually. I mean, I've read recently that, I would say it probably was. I mean, I'd written Murder, which was a TV drama with Imelda Staunton, Julie Walters, David Morrissey and On Paris, which was about the murder of a boy, after My Fragile Heart, which was the community piece I wrote for what was then Tiger Aspect. And I'd started to have, a few kind of award nominations. So there was a rumbling. But I think what was fascinating about Sex Traffic was by this point, I had just had my son. So I must have been 32, 33, that sort of period. And Lucy Richer, who was a producer I had met through the BBC, said, look, I've got some research. Will you take a look at it? And it was only a few weeks after my son was born. And I'd always, it went right back to that first place, which is the first play I wrote was very research-based. And I do like, my work tends to straddle many areas. And there's the pure work that goes back to very strong research work. And then there's sometimes work that's slightly more fantastical, probably Eric being one. But I think Eric's kind of fusion of those two things. But she approached me and said, just have a look at some research we've got. And so she sent over 5, 6, A4 thick files of work. And, this was it was early days of the internet and digital age. It wasn't just where you could Google everything. And so it was, it was lots. When I started researching, it was, it was the British Library, and it was, going into spaces and reading books. And so it was amazing to have the BBC who presented me with all this incredible research. And I knew within the first few pages there was just an extraordinary story here. And so I was put together with Derek Wax, who is a fantastic producer who I went to work on with again. And I think that was, sorry if I forgive me, I think it was a Channel 4 project as I remember it. Which, and I there was some, I was starting to meet Lucy. That was it. Lucy at the time was at Channel 4. Sorry, Lucy Ritchie. She then went to BBC. And also Tessa Ross, who was another great commissioner at the time, who's, both of these commissioners, it's the start of those relationships you make. And I still work with those women today. So, there's I tended to work with 5 or 6 of the same people over the last 25 years. But from that, there was this incredible body of research. So in the very early months of my son, being at home with my son, I started to plot this idea, a very simple idea of this 2-part, which was triggered mainly by a tiny bit of video research they had, which was a series of interviews with trafficked women. And there was one in particular that really grabbed my attention, which was 2 young trafficked sisters, probably in their late teens, early 20s, being interviewed in a police station. And throughout the conversation, you learnt one of two things. You learnt that one of the sisters had been trafficked and the other sister had got herself trafficked to try and find her, and she'd found her and brought her home. And this scene, and while you were watching this little scene, and what you could see one or two things. You could see the older sister who'd got herself trafficked to bring her sister home was very attentive, was trying to answer the questions, was holding the hand of her sister, almost trying to keep her in the room. And then you kept on hearing the ping of the sister's phone, and she kept on getting up and going out. And a couple of months after this was filmed, the sister then was re-trafficked and went out again. And I realised that phone call, the person who was ringing her was her pimp. And that though she had been reconciled and brought home, the kind of economic cycle of getting, falling back into that career and being, mistreated was still going on, and that she hadn't separated herself from her trafficker / boyfriend at the time. And I thought, my God, there's something extraordinary here. And so that became the starting point for Sex Traffic. And then over the next year, we did a huge amount of research, and the film was then commissioned by Channel 4. The 2-part was commissioned, and I wrote both episodes. And very quickly, we were very fortunate. It got a green light, and that was when we started to build the whole show. What was elemental and key to that was the arrival of David Yates, who is a fantastic director, quite early on in his career actually. Then, and he was just phenomenal. And that was when I really understood the value of a TV director who really because often TV directors come in later than film directors. I mean, the landscape has really shifted now, and people tend to initiate work, so that includes directors. But when I first started, the ideas were very much generated just by the TV writers, and film was often directors, were in a much longer lead time on a project, and TV directors tended to come in later. And that is still true of a lot of series. But I think with David Yates, it became very apparent early on that he really knew how to handle what was effectively a kind of political thriller, which had this very simple strand, which is the quest of one sister to find her other sister who goes missing after, accepting an invitation to be a waitress whilst abroad. And you realise that the other sister goes with her, and in going with her, they both get embroiled and go on this huge kind of a journey from Moldova all the way through Italy and arriving finally in the UK. And so it was focused on that. And then it was all about the elements that had constructed, supported, and was stopping these girls safely returning home.
Just moving to some different projects of yours, your adaptations of Brick Lane and Birdsong, how does your process for adaptation compare to original material? And then Rachel found this quite fun line that she does a screenwriting diploma of: sometimes you have to be promiscuous to be faithful. What are your thoughts on the whole adaptation piece?
I think you have to always think about it as, yes, it's a reinterpretation, but it's also a recreation. And, I think I think you have to be very clear about what your thesis is, what you're going to either take from the book. Are you going to be very faithful to that book? Because the book has a kind of genuinely beautiful thesis. Sometimes it can be an incredibly loved book. Both of those books were very loved. Adaptation I love, and I also find problematic. I've done and continue to do adaptation. I adapted Manhattan Beach a couple of years ago that we're trying to attach actors to at the moment, Jenny Egan novel. And, I really enjoy sometimes sinking into the arms of a novelist and their storytelling. But you also feel a huge weight of responsibility, and sometimes you get it right and sometimes you get it wrong. I mean, I think Brick Lane is a case in point. I don't think necessarily I was the right writer for that in reflection. I think it probably should have been someone who reflected the culture, who had really understood that world. But the other key thing, it points to your quote you just gave, which is, I think the promiscuity means sometimes you have to kill your darlings in order to truly carry the intent and the emotion of the book. Not everything translates. But there's a very key moment in Brick Lane, which actually I got wrong, which is there's a protest march in Brick Lane, and I didn't want to have it because I was concerned it had never existed, and I was worried at that time of whether it would be reactionary. And I made a mistake. We never had it, and we should have had it. And it was true to the book. And I've found again and again, if you stray too far away from the beauty of the novelist's voice, it normally falls apart. So you either have to stay close, or you either have to make a very key decision about what your thesis is going to be, and be key about what you are going to take from that, and recognize sometimes you may be deciding to take one character. I mean, you may be deciding to focus and reconfigure the POV of a novel. Sometimes the worst novels make the best films, because you can go really far with that. You don't have to be so faithful. And sometimes you get it right, and sometimes it's hard and you get it wrong. And I'm not entirely sure where I land with adaptation, but I do know that, I get excited when I see a piece of work and I realize, and everything is about IP now as well. So I'm realizing more and more that actually I've often generated my own IP, and I can see the luxury of actually taking on board someone else's and the joy of that. So right now I'm kind of ready to lean into a big piece of IP. I'd like to have a nice big novel to lean into again, even though it creates its own challenges.
And The Iron Lady, again, was an adaptation of a different kind, and it's an adaptation of someone's real life into a film. How did you find that experience? And how did you kind of go about the research? Where did you start?
Well, when I was given the project of The Iron Lady, there was already a script attached, and it was very focused on the sinking of the Belgrano. And at that time, I felt there was a fascinating script, and it was actually a very good script, but there was a desire to incorporate a broader image of her life. But they wanted to find some kind of organizing principle, some kind of thesis again for it. And I had just read a long article that Carol Thatcher had written about her relationship with her mother and her mother's experience of dementia. And I hit on very quickly this idea of, oh gosh, that's fascinating, isn't it? It's almost like a King Lear character, and it's about the power of loss and the loss of power of a very public figure. And then I saw a tiny photograph of her just looking through a window of a building, just through the side of a doorway. And I thought, oh gosh, that's somehow you want to be able to, whether you care, you revere or revile her politics, there was still such an important piece of history that this woman's life held. And also she's such a fascinating character. So I think myself and Phyllida Lloyd and Damien Jones, who was the producer at the time, worked very closely about really working out what that should be. And so I came up with a very simple idea that, the Margaret Thatcher we see, she's very late on in life. She's living with a kind of growing sense of dementia. And out of that dementia, she manifests her husband. And through their conversations, but also the very simple metronome of the few days she's living in this beautiful apartment, now no longer a prime minister, she's able to go back and recall and reconnect with some of those big moments in her political career. And so we took very early on, but also we cherry picked. I mean, one of my frustrations with biopics is it is incredibly hard, obviously, to grab every moment of someone's life. And I still think sometimes the best biopics work when you take a decision. You kind of take the weekend Sinatra caught a cold, or you take a week with Marilyn, or you decide to just focus on that last year in someone's life as a way to understand the whole. But I think Margaret Thatcher, above all else, there are so many films you could have got out of that one life that, we didn't touch on the miners' strike. There was, it became problematic, and so all I tried to hold on to was this very simple thesis of this woman having to reconcile herself to the reality of what she had become. And that's what I played around with.
One point that often comes up when we talk to screenwriters is the distinction between a kind of American showrunner writer's room model and a British tradition more centered around a singular writer. What's your view on the relative merits of the two systems? And is that distinction blurring in a more internationalized world?
Well, your second question, yes. To go to your first question, I mean, I think for a long time it was an economic factor. I think American showrunners and their staff of writers were paid as a collective, often of executive producers, writers, So there was a very strong financial commitment to those writers and a breadth of time to work within. And we just didn't have that model in quite the same way. I think it's changing. I think we were learning a lot from the showrunner model. But also they had very long form television. They make 22 episodes. We haven't traditionally tended to do that, but with the rise of the streamer, with television the platforms becoming much more global, then we are seeing much longer running shows. And, I think there are certain British showrunners, Jesse Armstrong being an absolute case in point, he's a genius showrunner. I hear only good things from his room, which is very unusual. And he seems to be brilliant at spinning the plates of several writers at the time, and they seem to work brilliantly as a collective. And, the work speaks for itself. It's just, probably the best bit of television for the last decade, if not more. But that has been quite unusual traditionally. And I think it's been a number of factors. I think when you talk to American showrunners, they commit to a long time. We're talking 4 or 5 months of work in the room every day. It's like a day job. And I don't think we've done that level of commitment over here. However, I think in seeing the success of the model of the American model, we are probably starting to invest in a slightly different way over here. But it tends to be our show running models over here. We just don't give as long, and we don't financially support in quite the same way. And I think that's what would fundamentally change it. And then I guess the ambition for a longer form of writing as well is also part of it. Personally, I've had, shows where we've brought other writers on. I think most writers overwrite. Most showrunners often overwrite. And I think one of the key things is get to a point where you feel like the other writers on your staff, on your room, actually get to really hold and own their own episode. And I think even the best shows, you find that most of the key writers have overwritten, or there's been a collective working on each episode. So I don't think it's perfected in its art form yet. But what I do think is important, and one of the reasons why I've always loved television is, I think it's a quietly political space, because you can, I love the democracy. You can watch on your phone, you can watch on your iPad, you can watch on a computer, and you can watch in the privacy, and that you can be transforming and telling a story to someone who's entirely on their own, or in a large, in a sitting room of people. So I think that's an element that I've always loved about television. But also, I think that TV writers are really put at the centre of the process of television, because we have to, it all begins with the script. And that's also evolving, because we've obviously got a lot of film talent that's come into television. And so there's a desire to be really involved in the development. And I think that is ultimately a great thing, because a little bit like we started saying, I think the script is the muse, and you want to keep those conversations around the script as long as possible, even around those cuts, because just in discussing those cuts, you start to understand more about the show you're trying to make. So I don't really have one theory. I've never been in a writer's room other than my own. I'd love to go into someone else's writer's room. I'd love to go and sit with Shonda, Rhimes, or, Jesse Armstrong, and spend some time, because I'm probably not the best person to ask, because on the whole, I either have some brilliant writers who come in and maybe write 1 or 2 episodes, but on the whole, I tend to write all my own work on my own. But that's because I never do more than 6 episodes. It's not like doing 10, 12, 22 if you're doing, perhaps a shorter form, like, a half-hour, 40-minute form.
You mentioned earlier the kind of difficulty in your 20s of making a living and a career out of this. And it's a rule of the show that we ask guests about how they've made it work on a kind of practical financial level. How have things changed for you since sort of your late 20s, early 30s today, in terms of how your income is divided, maybe from TV work and film and plays and also your book as well?
Well, as I said, I did every job under the sun as a lot of, and one of the key jobs I did, and it's quite well documented, is I worked as a caretaker in the day, looking after empty office space buildings, and they were brilliant, the people who ran it, because I basically had to just occasionally show people around the office space. But most of the time, they were cool about me writing, so I was able to write. So it kind of became a way to do it. And then I waitressed in the evenings. And I think what's probably changed now in terms of the kind of, where's the cut of my money come? I mean, it varies. I'd love to think that my stage plays were kind of bringing in the big bucks cash, and they do tend to be those, 229, a production's being done, was made this month because one of your productions was done in Brazil. So there are certain, but they do a tiny little level of income. I've never had a big West End hit. I haven't done a Jerusalem or I can't think of another play, but a War Horse or something that's had a huge life. I tend to make the main bulk of my money from television. And that's partly because it's been where I've had some of my strong relationships. I try and write a couple of films a year. And obviously that's a big divide between doing a Hollywood studio where I have a studio fee, which is considerably more than doing perhaps, a smaller independent film, which just cannot support that level of commission. And so I tend to try and do a Hollywood film once a year, and that can also be script doctoring. I might be doing an invisible rewrite, a silent rewrite, where I'll be brought in to do a sort of 10-day pass on a movie that, will earn me a large sum of money. Very useful when I need to bail myself out of the tax situations. But most of the time, I think one of the things I think more about is about quality in my life, and TV takes a lot. TV series, it consumes you, and particularly I've done a tiny bit of directing over the last couple of years, which I really, really love, but it really takes up the time, and it doesn't afford the same financial return as my writing. So I'd like to free up a bit more time to perhaps do a little bit more directing, and that would slightly change how I would work. But yeah, so I probably steady the ship with a Hollywood movie, and then I try and do one of the films I love. I mean, obviously, again, we're talking about a changing landscape. There's $10, $12 million films, which were the kind of mainstay of so much really great British filmmaking, are really hard to make at the moment. You can perhaps make the small and the massive, but that's quite a hard space. And then television, fortunately, yes, we're definitely going through a bumpier period in television, and there's been a reduction in content. And I think we all have to slightly hold our nerve. But there is still a great desire for content, and there's this great thirst and appetite for content. And so TV has always been my natural home anyway. And then I once in every 5 years, I try and write a stage play just to polish and brush up my voice again.
Talking about quality of life, can you tell us about This Is Not a Pity memoir and this extraordinary period and very challenging period that you went through with your husband with encephalitis and this delusional condition? Tell us about that, and then, the experience of writing it up as well.
Well, my husband collapsed in 2018 with a brain seizure, which then very quickly, over the next 2 weeks, meant that he had a kind of physical and psychological breakdown, which meant that, within 2 weeks, he was then placed into a induced coma, where he stayed in for the next 7 months and was woken up at the end of January 2019. And as we know, when he woke up, he had it was just, we could start to see we were all euphoric, and we could start to see the hope of recovery in a way that we had not expected. But it was also apparent that he'd changed in a profound way. And yes, he had developed a very rare delusion called Capgras delusion, which is the belief in doubles, imposters or doubles. And it tends to be focused on someone that you're very close to, or it can be focused on your house or a dog. It tends to be, and suddenly you believe that the thing that you're seeing is not the real thing. It's not your house, it's not your dog, it's not your wife, as it was with me. And so Jacob sadly no longer recognized me, and it probably took another 2 years for him to then recognize me. And so during that time, he was in hospital for 15 months. And then when he came home, we worked in a system where he fundamentally believed that I must be someone working for the state and helping him look after him and look after his children. Our children at the time were 14 and 16. And it sounds, as you would imagine, the stuff of novels, drama. And, what does any dramatist do when faced with challenges in life is that they write their way out of a situation. And that's what I did. And so writing has never been such an important, cathartic, essential element in my life. Actually, I think the thing is, if I don't write after a week, I start to get jangly. I have to write. So I would have always written. But we were also then hit with COVID. So living in a house with a partner at that time who didn't know who I was. Fortunately, he was very lovable. And two brilliant teenagers who were desperate to get out. Writing became my retreat. And so I would write. I wrote the memoir very quickly. So I wrote it over about 3-4 weeks. And I wrote it in my evenings. And really, the memoir is really me looking back at my life with Jacob and our relationship and trying to understand our relationship. It's also a conversation with Jacob, but also it's about the screenwriter in me and the art, the dramatist in me, looking at an experience happening, trying to control that experience, accepting that I cannot control that experience, but also recognizing that there were brilliant moments, very funny moments of drama, often acutely painful moments of drama. And also the other thing, very simply, I developed probably only while Jacob was in hospital. And in the very early months of Jacob returning, I developed breast cancer, stage 3, grade 3 breast cancer. So I also then went through 10 months treatment for breast cancer. And so at that time, Jacob and I, who, I like to think that we were vital, we were relatively young. Jacob was, 45 when he collapsed. I was 49. We suddenly aged in every way and we became strangers to each other and strangers to ourselves. So I think the one thing that kept me centered and whole and again drew me forward was writing. And so I poured myself, my feelings, and my desire to hold us together as a family and my belief that Jacob would come back into that book. And the silver lining to this is Jacob did come back. He did, we're now 6 years on, and nearly 6 years on. And yes, he's fundamentally changed. And yes, we will never, be truly the same family that we were, but we're also stronger. And he's a brilliant man. And in 2021, after I think 18, 19 years being together, maybe longer, we got married. So there was a real commitment to continue. And so I feel very lucky, but I will be eternally grateful to my editors and my agent and to everybody who read that book, because I don't think I would have, and my family and my friends, but my family in particular, I don't think I would have survived the experience. So the book was, it was essential, really.
A testament to the importance of storytelling on a kind of prosaic, but not prosaic level, a survival one. We've come towards the end of our time, and I hope it's okay that I can ask you this as a note to end on, but I saw that you're mentioned as the co-author or co-writer of the forthcoming Bridget Jones film. What can you tell us about Bridget Jones 4?
Well, I mean, absolutely, honestly, it's a project I was brought onto for a few, 10 days. I love that team. Helen Fielding is exquisite. Bridget Jones is, a much loved, very precious book. And, I was just another voice in the room that helped bring that film forward. It's now shooting. I'm very excited about the cast. I'm really excited to see, Helen at the helm of it. And, like everybody else, I'm really looking forward to watching it. So yeah, it was a really fun thing to do. And Dan Mazer is another brilliant writer who I know personally, and he's brilliantly funny. And I know that he was also a key voice in the room. And I think it's probably a testament to the fact that films often are born of the collective, And I feel it was a lovely job to do.
Well, look, thank you for a fascinating and wide-ranging interview, and wishing you all the best with all your numerous projects going forward.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Take care.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Abi Morgan. She's on Twitter at AbiM. She's on Instagram at AbiMorgan9. And Eric is streaming on Netflix. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Abi?
I really like interviewing screenwriters because it's a world that I'm instinctively much less familiar with. It's not one that I've worked in, but I'm certainly interested to learn more about and things like that. And you do just, in a sense, get the sense that it's a kind of more functional ecosystem, and I'm sure it's very hard to break into, and it's hugely competitive, but, it is better paid, and, it's not as the top people aren't kind of scratching a living in the way that you feel even a lot of kind of established print writers are. So I think the sort of economics of it are interesting. What about you, Rachel?
I think it's definitely worth getting more on the show to get more of a sense of the economics. I was fascinated by how the process of packaging shows has changed, in that there's more extensive development today. I thought Abi spoke very interestingly on how the mood board can be a really useful creative tool, and it reminded me of the interview that we did with David Nichols, who does that for his novels as well. And also as someone who finds the biopic form quite dissatisfying often to watch, it was great to hear her talk about the wisdom in choosing to focus on something more narrow as a way into understanding a broader story. I thought that was a viable insight.
I think, having just suggested that screenwriting is a kind of idyll, I suppose the other point is that, nothing gets made, right? I mean, that's the other thing, that mentally getting one's head around from a writing culture where publication is everything, and without publication there is nothing, and you're also not paid, to a sense that it's very normal to work on stuff that may never see the light of day, that there's this kind of tremendous funnel effect. So clearly that is a very different ecosystem to work in, although, you know, she's operating at a really high level and has had a lot of stuff made. But yeah, just a different world, and one that is fascinating to get dispatches from.
Absolutely. What have you been up to, Simon?
I'm back in the UK, and I've enjoyed getting back into a kind of work rhythm, working on my book largely, but also just an opportunity to do some exercise and kind of eat properly and not be running around all the time. So the plan is to have the first rough cut of my manuscript done by the end of August, and then to move into kind of editing and pulling it together. And I think that is manageable. So I'm working this month and going on holiday next month, but I quite like working in August. Actually, it's a kind of quieter time when there's lesser distractions and that sort of thing. And in terms of cultural intake, I'm continuing to read this autobiography by Roger Frisson-Roche, a French novelist and kind of traveller and stuff like that, which is actually incredibly engaging and really fascinating and pretty linguistically pretty accessible as well. What about you, Rachel?
Excellent. Well, it's nice to have the deadline of a holiday, at least. I have been doing various things, actually. Anyone who follows The Economist on Instagram may have seen me as well as heard me. I was asked to do these videos advertising our best books
I saw it today.
So far. I actually haven't watched it all the way through. I've only managed about 10 seconds because I find watching myself excruciating, much like I find listening to myself excruciating. So I'm probably in the wrong job. Anyway, I've been doing that. And then I've been working on 2 long gestating pieces about fashion, one about fashion photography and one about fashion on screen. So as part of that, I was watching the Balenciaga show on Disney+. So yeah, it's been busy, but it's good. I agree with you. August is quite a nice time actually to get stuck into things, even though it's horribly hot.
Yeah, the heat is challenging. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin, our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.